Thank you to the organizers for making me do a keynote in addition to a symposium talk. The keynote really is an honor. As a scientist, to give to your academic society, the keynote is indeed a true honor. It doesn't come along very often. To be able to do it to honor a friend and a colleague, someone you've worked with so closely as I have with Gord Sleivert, is an even bigger honor. So it is truly a fabulous opportunity for me, and one that I treasure to be able to share this information with you and give a little tribute to Gord. So Gord and I, we started in Eastern Canada together. I was at Dalhousie, started in 1998, and he came in 2000. And for a short period in about the mid-2000s, we were really Tweedledee and Tweedledum. We did a lot of work together. Our first NSERC was actually a group NSERC between the two of us, so it was shared between the two universities, and as I'll show later, we also shared a lot of students between us. That first NSERC wasn't for a lot of money. It was for $19,000 between the two of us. We also, being in Atlantic Canada at the time, we didn't really have a lot of startup, so we had to be really creative. And one of the things that Gord is really, I think of when I think of Gord, is he's really a doer. He just likes to get going and just figure things out. And being environmental physiologists, really our stock and trade, we all have the key equipment that we need to do our work. In our case, it's really an environmental chamber. But with $5,000 startup, it's pretty challenging to get that done. But Gord just barged ahead, and he, at UNB, at the next building, they had some individuals they had some renovations, so after all the rubble was there and the workman was going to clear it away with all the old insulation and stuff, he just went up to them and says, "Are you just going to be tossing that out? Can I take this?" And next thing you know, he built an environmental chamber using old insulation and using all sorts of stuff cobbled together. This is a picture of Shonda Morrison and with Gord in the early days at UNB, doing some of her really nice work that I'll be talking about later. And inspired by Gord, there became a whole proliferation of very cheap but very effective environmental chambers all around Atlantic Canada. The one on the upper right is mine, and my students nowadays, I have really nice facilities at Brock. My students nowadays don't really know what I'm talking about when we said we built a chamber with $200 of shower curtains and space heaters. But the spirit is still alive. The picture down on the bottom right is Dr. Shonda Morrison now. She works in Slovenia, and this is a picture she just sent me of her and her students in their environmental chamber, which was also shower curtains and space heaters. So I like to think that's a little bit of a tribute to Gord, how his message of let's just figure things out, let's just get things done, kind of permeated around the world. So what I'm going to talk about today is something that Gord and I did a lot of work together. It's really looking at why do we fatigue in the heat? Why can we not work as hard in the heat? So we'll start with hopefully proving to you that this is the case, and then we'll talk a little bit about two main interventions, talk about pre-cooling, and then talk about heat adaptation, and then we'll talk about some of the devils in the details, about the little mediating factors that we need to be considering if we are implementing these countermeasures. So the first thing is, does heat actually impair performance? And so one of the really nice studies was done by Brett Ely in 2007. And what he looked at was a retrospective study looking at a lot of marathons in different environments at different times, looking at the effect of temperature on the running performances. And he tracked essentially the first 300 finishers in a lot of different marathons. And he looked at the environmental temperature. So what you have is WBGT on the different axes here, different graphs, ranging from 10 degrees through to 25 degrees. We had the marathon times, again, from the very, very fast finishers, the top guys just over 2 hours, to the still really fast guys, the ones who finished in about 180 minutes, so 3-hour time, so still quite fast. And the thing he found was that at all different fitness levels, that there was impairment already at relatively moderate temperatures. So if you look at the difference between 10 degrees WBGT and 15 degrees, there was already significant impairment. And then as you keep going, it was almost a progressively more and more impairment. The other thing that he found was that this was the case at all ability levels. So even if you're extremely fit, you're still going to be impaired. You're not going to be as impaired as the less fit individuals, and that'll come up again later in the talk. So again, relative effect is worse for the slower runners than it is for the faster runners. He also did the same analyses for females, found pretty much the exact same trends, so it was consistent across the sexes. The other evidence he had in that same paper was to profile individuals in the Boston Marathon 2005, 2006, and looked at the ones that raced in both marathons and across the 2 years, and then just did a scatter plot of their two performances. And what he found was that of the 292 individuals he tracked, 251 was slower in 2005, where it was warmer at 13 degrees, than in 2006. There's obviously, being scientists in this room, there's one big caveat we have to look at. Obviously, the slower time was in 2005, faster time in 2006. So it could be the case that these individuals just had more experience, were fitter, and were more trained. But this does kind of help add support to the idea that if it was a hotter environment, even though not that hot realistically, 7 degrees and 13 degrees WBGT, there already was an impairment in performance. So as a message too, I showed that the slower runners had more impairment than the faster runners. For those individuals in the crowd who may be advising sports events, advising marathons, the other thing to really think about is to really look after those slower individuals. The faster individuals, they're going to be done in 2.5 hours or so, and their risk isn't as high as those individuals later. The risk is compounded because over the course of a day, generally the temperature rises. And so you can have those faster individuals already finish their marathon by the time it gets hot later in the day, whereas those slower individuals are already more susceptible to heat stress. They're also out there in the hotter parts of the day. So you really need to keep in mind how this can change over the course of a day. The Chicago Marathon really found this out to their detriment in 2007. At the start, at around 7 a.m., it was 22 degrees WBGT. 3.5 hours later, where again the slower runners were still out on course, it had gotten to 28.9 degrees by the time they decided to cancel the marathon part way. But the tragedy was that there was a lot of hospital admissions, a lot of individuals who were suffering heat stress, and one cardiac death as a result during this race by the time they pulled everyone off course. The other thing to keep in mind as we're thinking about different events is that running isn't necessarily cycling. So I think about this morning when I was on the treadmill and say, like, I really wish I was on the bike instead. But the other difference between it is that air resistance in cycling is really the dominant factor. Generally, cyclists go a lot faster than runners. And for the large part, there is obviously some overlap depending on discipline. For example, mountain biking, you may be going a lot slower. But certainly out on the road, you're going a lot faster. A typical group may be going at 30 to 40 kilometers an hour or more, whereas even the fastest runners are in the 20 kilometers an hour range. So that makes a big difference in the air resistance and the convective airflow across the body to help with cooling. So studies that are done in cycling may not necessarily transfer to running, and vice versa because of the differences in the actual speeds. And certainly in cycling, when you're trying to achieve optimal performance, such as the hour record where you go as fast as you can for an hour, generally the track is set to be as hot as possible, as tolerable, so that the air resistance is less because of lower air density, and also because the track itself may be faster because the boards are drier. Where it happens in the lab that we really have to be concerned about is if we are doing a lot of our studies indoors in our chambers and such, and we are using cycling as a test modality, but we don't really have good convective cooling. So a lot of studies, at most, they may just have either no cooling at all, or no fans at all, or just your garden variety fan from Canadian Tire. Really minimal airflow. It can really affect the scientific results. Shonda Morrison that I talked about earlier, we showed this in 2014 when we looked at if you were doing pre-cooling, but you don't have adequate airflow, essentially the pre-cooling benefits completely disappear. And so there's been a nice study that is just coming out in APNM actually, talking about the need to really have good progressive airflow, at least at the level of approximately 10 kilometers an hour and beyond, because anything below that, it's not relevant to cycling because of the minimal airflow. So that's kind of the public service awareness message. And so other areas where heat seems to affect our ability to exercise. This is a classic study from Jose Gonzalez Alonso when he was at the Copenhagen Muscle Research Center in Denmark. And this is really, really interesting study. What they did was looking at pre-cooling or preheating individuals on the left graph there, from anywhere from the middle line is their normal body temperature of 37 degrees. In one test, one condition, they preheated them to about 38.3. In the others, they cooled them down to about 36 degrees. And then they had them exercise in a hot environment at a steady rate until voluntary exhaustion. And the really nice thing that they have in Denmark at Copenhagen is that they really have no ethical limit for upper body temperature. So they could take the participants much higher than most of us can in our labs. So what they found was that it was, regardless of your starting core temperature, the rate of heat storage was about the same, but the temperature at which you voluntarily stopped, and these were trained individuals, was really similar, right around 40.2 degrees or so, regardless of the starting core temperature. The second half of the study, they had a liquid cooling garment on, like I showed yesterday or 2 days ago in the symposium. And in one condition, they cooled the individuals as they were riding. In the other conditions, the cooling was turned off. So the rate of heat storage was different. But again, they found that the temperature at which the individuals voluntarily stopped exercising was really similar. And this led to this whole idea of, is there a direct role of hypothermia on exercise performance? And this whole debate that went on in the 2000s about whether there is a critical internal temperature at which people voluntarily stop exercising. So that was one arm of the debate, but the other arm of the debate, it really led to a lot of work by different labs looking at why is it that high body temperatures actually fatigue us? What are the different kind of physiological factors and mechanisms? So now that I've scared you that there's a terminal or potentially a critical voluntary core temperature, let's take a step back and from that scare tactic and say, is there an individual threshold core temperature? And as we'll see, there's a lot of individual variability in how we tolerate exercise. So this study by a British and Singapore research collaboration, they tracked 18 kind of Singapore Army Reserve individuals who were also competing in the Singapore Half Marathon. As you can imagine, very hot, very humid environment. And they were trained, they were acclimatized. And the reason that's important will come up later. And what they looked at was they had the ingestible temperature pills, and they tracked their core temperature throughout the entire run. And what they found was these were individual plots of I believe, 6 individuals as they were running. And the things to point out in this graph is that there's a huge, wide individual variability. You look at the patterns of some individuals who started hot and then kind of almost cooled down and then heated up again. You had other people who just started and got hot and then plateaued. But the interesting thing was, and this was something I talked about 2 days ago in the symposium, there's really no single kind of cutoff that you can really say for everybody. It's highly individualized at what point that they stop exercising or that their performance is really impaired. And also, many of them were able to tolerate much higher core temperatures than what we think of. For example, in ethics, in my lab, we're generally able to go to 40 degrees, but most of the time we stay kind of safer at 39.5. Well, most of these individuals would have had to be pulled out if that was the case. But yet they all finished the race, they all did decent times, and they were asymptomatic, even though, again, 2 out of 18 individuals went over 41 degrees Celsius at some point during the run. Another study was also from Eli, and what they did was they did an outdoor run on a 400-meter track with, again, trained runners, and they did an 8K run, and they did it in cool environments and also in hot environments. So we have the cool environments and the hot environments on the right, and he had groups that were separated in terms of by the 7.4 K mark, their core temperature was either below 40 degrees or above 40 degrees. So they had either a cool environment or a hot environment. They had individuals who, by the final 600 meters, was either hot or they weren't kind of hyperthermic. And they looked at specifically that final 600 meters to see whether they could still kind of have that last end spurt performance. And they found that in all cases, there was really no impairment in performance in the last part of the run, even though, again, the individuals were already hyperthermic, some were above 40 degrees. So in essence, you could still push yourself pretty hard at the end. And again, this is the end spurt, so there's a lot of potentially kind of individual central kind of mental control of that, and we'll reflect back on that later. But the idea overall is that there isn't necessarily a single threshold temperature. Bringing it back to, again, if we were advising marathons, if we're advising events, if we're tracking individuals, it's not enough to just say necessarily that, okay, anyone that goes above X core temperature, we have to pull for safety reasons, because especially if you're fitter, it seems that you can tolerate a lot more heat. So I said a couple of slides ago that Jose Gonzalez Alonso's work really led to a lot of research into looking at individual physiological systems and how does a high body temperature affect that. In 2004, Gord and I wrote a review in ESSR, kind of trying to sum up the research to date and some of the best knowledge that we had at the time about the impact of on different physiological systems. So looking at from left to right, we have hot or humid environments or exercise leading to hyperthermia, and this could lead to changes in gut blood flow and endotoxemia. This could also change our brain chemistry and neurotransmitters, and a Belgian group has done a lot of work on that, and some of the work in my lab coming up wants to explore this more. Also, high brain temperatures seems to have kind of effects on our EEGs. So some of the work has been looking at tracking some basic EEG measures and demonstrating that there seems to be a decreased arousal with exercise in the heat, and that may be leading to higher perceptual sensations, higher ratings perceived exertion, and ultimately causing us to slow down, whether physiologically or psychologically. So obviously, this was 13 years ago. There's been a lot more work done on it. This same schematic would probably blow up quite a bit more nowadays. So another work that Gord and I did early on during our time when I was at Dalhousie and he was at UNB with two of our students, Shonda Morrison and Melissa Thomas, was we really looked at trying to separate out the effects of exercise in the heat and trying to remove the exercise component. A lot of the works to date when we did these studies really had individuals before exercise in the heat and then after they became exhausted exercising in the heat. So our view was that we don't really know whether the impairment was due to the exercise per se or due to the temperature per se. So we developed this kind of passive heating and cooling protocol where we heated up individuals using a liquid cooling garment. In this case, it was a hot water going through. And then at every half a degree core temperature, we did maximal voluntary contractions. We also did interpolated twitches to look at central fatigue. And then once we got them to 39.5, we also cooled them back down. So we can look at the effect that way of hot temperature, core temperature, but with hot skin or cool skin. So we can start teasing out, is it local muscle effects or is it a kind of an overall global heating effect? So on the left there is, this is from Melissa's paper in 2006. And what we have on the left is the maximal voluntary contractions at 37 degrees going up to 39.5 and then going back down again. And what we see is that the MVCs, whether your muscle was, the local muscle was hot or cold, it was gradually, as we heated up, it was gradually decreasing. And then when we cooled them back down, it wasn't an instant return to baseline, but it required core temperature to be cooled back down before we see a return to baseline. We found the exact same pattern with the voluntary activation with interpolated twitches. So our conclusion for this was, from these papers, was that core temperature without any exercise influence with relatively low cardiovascular strain had a direct effect on neuromuscular activation. These were progressive changes with core temperature, and this was independent of skin temperature and also local muscle temperature. So now that we've hopefully shown that heat is negative in terms of our performance, we'll talk about two of the main strategies for adapting to heat. And again, this was a pamphlet that's put out by the Defense Organization in Singapore and given to their field commanders to educate them on what they can do with their troops. But there's a number of things that we can do. Certainly some of my PhD studies have shown that higher aerobic fitness does seem to decrease our response to heat, and we don't heat up as fast. We can also seem to tolerate higher core temperatures before we say we had enough. And we can also be providing, in a work environment, we can be providing rest schedules. We can make sure they're adequately hydrated with fluids. But the main things I'm going to talk about today are the ones in the middle. We're going to talk about pre-exercise cooling, and we're also going to talk about heat acclimatization. So first up is pre-cooling. So this was really started in the mid-90s. It really kind of exploded into the sports scene with the Australian rowers, the Atlanta Olympics, where they came with these ice vests that they were wearing during warm-ups, with the idea, and the theory behind pre-cooling is that you want to keep, if, for example, with Jose Gonzalez Alonso's work, we show that there is an upper limit to how hot you want to be. Well, if we can increase the thermal window of heat storage by cooling yourself beforehand, then theoretically that will allow us to work longer and or harder. So that's the theory behind pre-cooling in general. And certainly in terms of the devil being in the details with warm-up, you want to be keeping your overall core temperature low, but you also want to have the benefit of warm muscles. So as an example, in this cyclist here, they are warming up with a cooling vest with cold water running through, and she also has sleeves on that she's probably also pouring water on to help with evaporative cooling. So those are, in cycling, those are the relatively non-essential muscles, but yet she can still be warming up her legs and getting the entire metabolic pathways going. So again, the general theory of pre-cooling is that you're increasing the thermal window, and by doing that, you can also decrease the perceptual discomfort that you're feeling, and that may lead to higher pacing. There's lots of modalities that have been tried, and it really depends on the practicality of the sport or the situation. It could be ice vest, it could be cooling hoods, and I've done some studies looking at using cooling hoods on multiple sclerosis individuals too, to allow them to have less risk of heat problems with their symptoms and allow them to increase their daily activity. And so cooling hoods can be effective too. There can be cold or cool baths beforehand. And Paul Larson in Australia and New Zealand has done a lot of work looking at ice slurries, looking at ingesting, rather than cold drinks, ice, so that you are kind of melting the ice and adding an extra layer of heat sink capability. So it really depends in terms of choosing the modalities. It depends on the practicalities of the individual sport and the event itself. So does it work? Arngrimson in University of Georgia did a study where they had cooling vests on during 38-minute warm-up, and these were varsity runners in a hot environment. And they found after the warm-up with the cooling vest compared to the warm-up without the cooling vest, core temperature was 0.3 degrees less, their heart rate was lower, the ratings perceived exertion was lower, their thermal comfort was also better after the warm-up with the vest. What did it do to performance? And he broke it down into kind of essentially 3 segments of 1.7 kilometers each, and looked at, the main thing to look at is the time. The first kind of 1.6 kilometers, there really wasn't any difference in the time. The heart rate was all about the same. The VO2 perceived exertion was a little bit better with the vest warm-up, and they weren't wearing the vest during the run. This was only purely for the warm-up. And after 2/3 of the race, they had a significant difference in the time, and this continued onwards to the 5K. The interesting data on here is that the same physiological endpoints occurred. They were equally hot, equally kind of uncomfortable by the end, but they were willing, because they felt cooler during the early parts of the race, they were willing to self-select a higher pace. So this goes back to the idea that if you are cooler, your brain is sensing that you are not as uncomfortable, you're not at as high a risk, and therefore you are able to be riskier and choose a higher exercise intensity and push yourself harder. So we'll come back to this in terms of what are the real kind of challenges when we're trying to look at what's physiology and what is psychology. So in 2015, Chris Tyler from the UK and I prepared a meta-analysis looking at all the existing literature on pre-cooling, and there weren't that many at the time. There was 23, which is the overall here. This is the effect size on the y-axis, and overall of the 23 papers, there was a moderate to high improvement, but then we broke it down into individual sports, and this is again where you have to be really event specific. We found with sprinting, there was only 2 studies, but there was a net negative event, so you don't necessarily want to be cool if you're just going to be doing a power event. You want your muscles to be warm. We know that your speed of contraction of muscles, the power you can generate is much more when your muscles are warm and your body is warm compared to when it is cold. So for power sports, this may not be the ideal thing to do. With there was a moderate benefit with either intermittent exercise, which is the next one here, and then with endurance exercise, there was a huge benefit, as kind of shown previously in the Arngrimson study. There was only a few studies. There were 5 studies that looked at cooling during sports performance. So this is whether it is with cooling collars or with other kind of active strategies of cooling during exercise performance. Obviously, for most sports, it's very difficult to actually implement in reality, but there does seem to be a moderate benefit if that was the case. So if pre-cooling can be effective, the important thing is to do it properly. So this was a picture I took in 2012 at the prologue of the Tour de France in Belgium, where it was just stinking hot that day. And this is world champion cyclist in the time trial, Tony Martin, warming up on the trainer. There wasn't a fan in front of him, so it goes back to before. He was already building up a lot of heat. But compare the coverage here. All he had was this little ice vest that was really just covering a bit of his upper back. Most of his torso was completely uncovered, and I would say that he really wasn't doing a good job at all of pre-cooling. Compare that to an older picture from Corin Riviera, and look at the coverage there. Much tighter coverage over her entire torso. She also had a cooling collar on. She also had the sleeves on, so she was pouring water on them too. So that is a much more effective pre-cooling. So if you're going to do it, make sure you do it properly. Don't just do a little bit like what Tony Martin was doing here. Again, minimal coverage, minimal actual benefit to this. So that's pre-cooling. The next thing you can do is you can also, if you know you're going to be competing like in Tokyo 2020 in a very hot, humid environment, ideally you can adapt yourself to heat beforehand. So the second half of this talk is really going to focus on that. So this graph I'm not going to go through, but the main message from here is that when you are talking about heat acclimatization, you're talking about adapting your entire physiology. So your renal system, all your fluid balance systems, your baroreceptors, everything can be changed. It's not just, as I'll show in a little bit, it's not just a basic, your core temperature dropped, your heart rate dropped. There's a lot of things going on behind the scenes. So again, Chris and I and Gary Hodges here also did a meta-analysis that was published last year looking at all of the work on heat acclimatization. We looked at the magnitude of improvement in physiology and also performance. The other question we want to ask is there a dose response? Is there a minimum kind of protocol that we can get away with to see some benefit, and or do you need absolutely a certain amount of time? There's also, we want to look at some of the mediating factors such as age, fitness, and also sex to see whether there was any difference in response to heat acclimatization. And I don't think I pulled that. Whoops, my screen is just gone. Okay, so the meta-analysis process, we looked at English language. We used a whole bunch of search terms, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And we started with 9,500 abstracts or hits, and then we whittled it down at the end to 92 papers, and these did spread back very, very far back, just as Mike Joyner talked about, through to modern day. So this was done, it was published in 2016, but it was up to 2015 that we did this, and we did the usual kind of precautions and methodology with the meta-analysis. So the search results, what we came up with, we separated things out into different adaptation types. And heat acclimatization, there's a few ways you can do it. You can just tell everybody, okay, ride at 30K an hour for an hour a day. So it's a controlled type of adaptation in terms of you are just controlling the work that they are doing. And most of the studies use that because it's quite easy to implement. You just tell everyone, okay, just go at the same workload every day for 2 weeks or whatever. The more challenging ones is this isothermal method, where the whole idea is you get them up to a certain core temperature at, say, 38.5, and then you then adjust the exercise so that they maintain 38.5 for however long you want, so for 60 minutes or so. This is obviously a lot more challenging to implement in the field because you have to be tracking core temperature, you have to be getting them to be exercising at a certain rate, and then you have to adjust the work intensity throughout. But theoretically, this may be the best method because it is allowing you to control the thermal stimulus. There's also the self-paced protocol, which is just, for example, you just tell people, you may have a heart rate monitor on and you say, exercise at 130 beats per minute for 60 minutes. So they are essentially self-adjusting their workload based on their physiological strain day to day and also their improved fitness over the course of 2 weeks. So we separated that out. We also separated out duration, looking at short term, medium term, long term. So anything from 7 days to the standard, which is generally up to around 2 weeks, to anything over 2 weeks, which are pretty rare. So what the information in the brackets is how many studies did that and also how many individuals were in those studies. Overall, we had 976 participants, only 8% female, so it may be somewhat difficult to extrapolate fully across the sexes. The limitation anytime with heat acclimatization is you're never blinding the individuals. So if you're looking at it strictly from a meta-analysis kind of quality of studies, most of these studies would be very low because they didn't have blinding, but also many of them had no control groups. It was just testing a group before and after heat acclimatization. There wasn't kind of a true control group. So with Alex Hutchinson in the room, being a sports science writer, he would probably also agree that you start with the lead, right? You lead the story off with the most important message. The most important message is, does this actually work? So here's the data on performance. There were 48 data sets. This is your typical plot of effect sizes, and what we have here is effect size. So this is 0 where there was no effect, and the main thing we're looking for with these forest plots is kind of are these plots, and do they cross the line, and how do they look overall? What we have here are the different types of adaptation. But I'm really, with these plots coming up, I'm going to be showing a few of them. I'm just going to be talking about the general trends here. But the performance effects, out of 48 studies, at least 43 had more than 1% improvement in performance, and these were either time trials or time to exhaustion type of exercise. The mean was 16%, the median was 8%, so quite a significant improvement in performance. We did find there was a general kind of progressively improvement with the longer heat adaptation protocols. So the short term and the medium term had a moderate effect, but the long term ones had the best effect. So the general idea is that you can get away with a little bit of heat acclimatization, but the longer they can be adapted, the better the performance is going to be. We found when we looked at the different modalities that the isothermal and the controlled group, where you're really controlling their physiological strain and adjusting it over the course of time as they become fitter and more adapted, they seem to have the best effect. The controlled ones still had a moderate effect, but the isothermal and the controlled methods seem to be better. There's no data on passive heat acclimatization for the Finns in the audience in their saunas. There was no effect of temperature, age, or fitness. With core temperature, the general trend is that there was a large decrease in core temperature after 2 weeks or so of heat acclimatization. That's really one of the classic symptoms that you will see with heat adaptation. So there was a moderate to large effect of resting mean temperature during their subsequent bout of exercise, and also at the same time. Obviously, if you were heat adapted and you can work longer, it's somewhat unfair to be looking at the last data points. So you are looking at the exact same data point as when they fatigued when they were before they were adapted. Duration effect, we found again, short and medium term had some improvement, but the longer you can do it, the better. There was again no significant effect of age, fitness, or sex. We also found a large decrease in skin temperature during exercise after adaptation. Cardiovascular, same idea. Another classic symptom of heat adaptation is at a lower resting heart rate, and we certainly found this. We found a significant benefit of a moderate to large effect of anywhere from 5 beats per minute resting heart rate to, during exercise itself, about 12 beats per minute lower at the same exercise intensity. This was, again, another example where a little bit will give you a benefit, but the more you can do it, the better. So the long-term heat adaptation was better than the short and the medium term. There was no real effect on blood pressure, stroke volume, cardiac output. And then with sweating and fluid balance, we found that the total sweat rate increased after you're heat adapted. That improvement came in 2 forms. You started sweating at a cooler temperature, so your threshold was lower, and also your sensitivity of your response was higher. The gain was higher. So for every degree of core temperature rise, the rate of rise of your sweat rate increased after heat adaptation. So you really had this global overall benefit. There was also, as we may guess, your body is trying to maintain electrolytes, so it is decreasing the sodium content of the sweat. It is managing to suck back and retain more of the sodium, so your sweat becomes a bit more dilute. This was a case where short term really didn't have much of an effect, but you needed around a week or more to really start seeing any benefits from heat adaptation on sweating. Sweating is traditionally kind of the slowest response compared to heart rate and core temperature. So this was a case where the short term may not really be a benefit if you were looking for maximizing the sweat response. We found there weren't that many studies that actually measured plasma volume, but in general, we found an increase in plasma volume and some measures of some of the hormones concerning fluid balance. There was also a decrease in thirst sensation and fluid consumption overall, which leads to the idea of perception. There weren't that many studies that actually track, surprisingly, the ratings of perceived exertion. That's what that little asterisk is for, showing that there's almost no studies on this. But in general, there was some improvement in your perception of the temperature and the thermal stress. We don't know, there's no studies looking at heat adaptation really on cognitive functioning. This idea of perception I find really interesting and is driving a lot of the research in my lab coming up. And one of the classic studies was done at DRDC Toronto by Peter Tequisis. And what they looked at was the effect of aerobic fitness on thermal perception. What we had were 2 groups. One was relatively untrained, the other was trained. They had them exercise with the chemical warfare clothing in a hot environment. And then what he had was the physiological strain index, which is a weighted measure of your heart rate response and your core response, and also a perceptual strain index, which is a weighted scale of your ratings of perceived exertion and your thermal comfort. The main thing to point out, up top here is the untrained, down here is the trained. So with the untrained, the physiological strain index and the perceptual strain index matched very closely. But the interesting thing was, here's the physiological strain in the fit group, but here's the perceived strain. So even though their actual physiological strain was similar in the trained groups than in the untrained groups, how they perceived it was a lot more comfortable. They were able to go longer because they didn't feel it was nearly as uncomfortable. So the question is, what is causing this? Why is fitness also seeming to have this improved psychological effect? This has led to some work with Mike Tipton's lab in the UK looking at psychological skills training. And this was a really nice study where they had trained runners run a 90-minute time trial on a treadmill before and after 2 weeks of psychological skills training. This was a really kind of a shotgun approach. They took 4 of the major kind of areas of sports psychology, from goal setting, visualization, positive self-talk. They had individuals perform it over 2 weeks, and then they had them do the time trial again. With the control group, there was no significant change in the run distance over those 90 minutes, but quite surprisingly, in the psychological skills group, they had 1.15 kilometer longer distance run over 90 minutes, even though there was no difference in their ear temperature, their skin temperature, sweat rate, or RPE. So there was also no difference in kind of their measures of fitness before and after in these 2 groups in terms of the VO2 maxes. So there was no real physical change, but that psychological skills training seemed to improve their willingness to go at a harder pace for the 90 minutes. We followed up on this with a master's student, Phil Wallace, and we focused on one aspect. We focused on the motivational skills training, and what we found was at the top is the control group, where there was before and after. There was no difference in our tolerance time to a very hard exercise on the bike in the heat, but in the psychological skills training group, we found 26% improvement in time to exhaustion. We also found, we did cognitive tests before and after, and we found an improvement in executive function test even when they were just before they exercise after the 2 weeks of skills training. Okay, so summarizing everything so far, hopefully I've demonstrated there's clear hypothermia impairments, and that also adaptation and countermeasures are possible, and but there seems to be a dose-dependent response. But the good thing is the short term, less than a week, still seems to have some benefit. Of course, as Mike Joyner pointed out, nothing under the sun is new. So this is a study from Pandolf. I didn't go all the way back to 43, but this was 77. He found essentially the same overall message. With heat adaptation, there's a decrease in resting core and heart rate. There's also a decrease in discomfort and thirst. So I would certainly echo the message, go back and look at the classics literature, and there's a lot that we can learn from those. So again, the effects of fitness, one of the things that Kent Pandolf found was that the fitter you were, the more rapidly you adapted to heat. And he developed the regression equation based on VO2 max. And he also found that the fitter individuals had slower decay of heat acclimatization, and they were also able to readapt quicker. However, we didn't find any of that in our meta-analysis. So this is one where our modern analysis of many studies differed from this one. The heat adaptation time course. This was a really interesting study looking at, okay, if heat adaptation works, how quickly does it work, and does it work in a real field setting? This was done by a Qatar and Danish group, and what they had were trained Danish cyclists perform an outdoor time trial in Denmark, pretty cold conditions, 5 degrees Celsius, and that was their average wattage over that time. They then left one group behind to continue their training in Denmark, took another group to Qatar, where it was much hotter. Then they had them perform the 43K time trial on day 1, day 6, day 13. So at the start, middle, and at the end of really 2 weeks of their training camp. What we found was that TH1, so there's your very first one, and the y-axis represents there's 100%, and here is your relative impairment based on that, and 100% is your outdoor time trial back in Denmark. So the very first day, as soon as they got there, there was a huge impairment. It was at about 80 to 85% of their normal capabilities. And then halfway through, they started readapting. Their performance improved again to about half way back. And then by the time they got to 2 weeks, they continued to improve. That all sounds great, but the main thing to remember is that this is 100%. So they never got back to their full capabilities, even in a pretty cold environment back in Denmark. So the main message is that heat remains a factor. You're never going to perform as well in the heat as you may in a cooler environment. The other nice thing they did with this study is they looked at kind of what happens afterwards. And in 2010, Chris Minson's lab came up with this study that suggested that just passive heat acclimatization without any physical training improved performance. So the question becomes, is heat acclimatization an ergogenic aid in cool environments? So can just being adapted help you in a cold environment in a similar way to altitude training? So what they did was they tracked these same riders when they went back to Denmark, and they repeated the 43K time trial in 13°C conditions, so cool or warmer than the 5 degrees of the initial test. And this was the control group and the heat adapted group. The main thing to point out is that the VO2 max didn't change in the heat adapted group when they came back to a cool environment. Their performance in that 43K time trial also didn't change. So this is their wattage before and after. There was essentially no difference. So the main message is that heat adaptation isn't going to help you back in the cold. It'll help you in the heat, but it's not an ergogenic aid for going back into cool environments. The other important question to ask is, okay, if heat adaptation can be useful, how do we adapt? And the question here is, does hot equals hot equals hot? With temperature, we can increase the heat stress by ramping up the temperature, ramping up the humidity, or having a lot of solar radiation. So does adaptation to one environment work just as well as another environment? And equally importantly, if I adapted to a hot and dry environment, what happens if I go into a hot and humid environment? So that's what I mean was, does hot equals hot equals hot? So there's only one study that's done this. There's a really nice study from Barbara Griffon. And what they had was they had a control group down on the bottom. They had one group where it was in a very hot ambient temperature environment. So it was a hot and dry adaptation. They had another one where it was this is the hot and dry environment, the 50°C. They had another one where it was very cool, but they had a really high radiative heat load. And then they had another condition where it was really relatively warm, but much more humid. So you notice that in those three conditions, the WBGT, what we classically define when we look at temperature or standardized across temperature, remains the same. It's just the different kind of stress that we are putting them. The really nice thing was they looked at the adaptation, and then they flipped it around. After the heat adapted group in the radiative group, they tested them again in a hot environment, and then they tested them in a hot and dry environment also to look at that adaptation across different thermal environments. The main message I'll go through is that the time course of all three types of heat adaptation in terms of over the course of the 2 weeks remained the same. So there was none that was necessarily faster than the other in terms of the core temperature and their heart rate response. And also what they found was that the heat adaptation to one environment did transfer across to another. So this is really good news if we're trying to implement kind of heat adaptation protocols, is while it may be ideal to simulate the exact environment that individuals may be facing, it may not actually be necessary. So if we don't have access to an environmental chamber or things, we can try to use other ways to, whether it's increasing the humidity or some other way of increasing the heat stress. Again, the main thing I'll point out is this is the only existing study. The other interesting question is, can we kind of accelerate heat adaptation? And Jim Cotter's lab in New Zealand has done a number of studies on this, combining short-term heat adaptation, so only 4 to 5 days of heat adaptation, with the stress of dehydration. Most of the time when we're having individuals heat adapt, we want to make sure they're properly hydrated. We want them to be properly recovered so that we aren't necessarily stressing them from a dehydration stimulus. But what Andy Garrett was really looking at is, well, do we want that? Why don't we try to maximize the stress by having them both be in the heat and also be dehydrated? Is there a synergistic effect between the two? So to test this, he did 5 days of isothermal heat adaptation in 38 degrees of 90 minutes each. And then in one group, he had them drink fluids throughout so that they were euhydrated. And in another group, they were dehydrated, so they didn't drink during their heat adaptation protocols. The main message from this is that surprisingly and quite interestingly, the dehydrated group, which is the solid lines here, had lower core temperature and also a lower heart rate by the end in the final test. So this is still kind of early days, but this may suggest that if you really want to accelerate and maximize the heat adaptation stimulus, you may not necessarily want them to be fully hydrated throughout. You may want them to be dehydrated to maximize the synergy between the two stresses. Okay. So to summarize my talk today, I would suggest that there is clear hypothermia impairments, that adaptation is possible, and it's a whole range of spectrums from physiological to the perceptual and the psychological. And that if you are going to be implementing heat adaptation, theoretically, the longer you can, the better, and this is especially true with sweating. You want as long a stimulus as you can to maximize that response, but that for performance and for the heart rate and core temperature, even a short-term adaptation of about 4 to 5 days may be useful, and that's really important if we're trying to implement practical heat adaptation strategies. If we have to be deploying to a hot environment very quickly. And then different modalities of pre-cooling and also heat adaptation seem to be equally effective, but how you choose them really comes down to the logistics and what will work best for your particular situation. And then the mediating factors, again, I just threw up some interesting data at the end looking at maybe we want to be dehydrating at the same time as heat acclimatizing. So again, it's truly an honor for me to say a few words about Gord over the course of today, and also to share this information with this audience here. So I really consider Gord my friend, my colleague. Obviously, we were close collaborators, and some of the stuff he taught me, I treat him as one of my mentors too. And we just had a lot of fun together in and out of the lab. I also want to acknowledge the students who couldn't be here today, but they all send their greetings to everyone and their love to Gord. These are students that Gord and I co-supervised and co-authored with. And again, we were just sharing students back and forth. For example, Carla, she did the first 2 of her 3 PhD studies at UNB, and then she moved over to Halifax and did the last one in my lab. Same thing with Shonda, she was just going back and forth. Leo and Melissa had invaluable help from Gord throughout. So it was really a true collaboration in every sense of the word. And I just want to say again to Gord, thanks for making our world better. Thanks for helping me in my path to science too. And thanks to all of you for your attention today.